So with that, Marion, why don't we get the poll going?
Sure. So this first one is the industry poll. Just launched it on the screen.
And again, we're just putting this in so it helps us to tailor what we're talking about a little bit to make it more relevant to you.
Give it about 10 more seconds here. Got a couple more people that need to respond. Okay. I'm going to close this one out. So kind of a diverse audience here.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, that's useful. And now one more poll, and then we're going to dig into some of the content. And again, this is really just for us to be able to shape the discussion to make it valuable to you. And at CRI, you know, we have, I think our flagship, it's safe to say, is the program, which is a 5-stage program that people go through or organizations go through with a cyber leader. In addition to that, we do generate a lot of other content, but here we're really talking about the program itself. So knowing where you are in it is really helpful to us.
Give it about 15 more seconds. Okay. So it looks like most people are here to find out more about our program.
Perfect. Okay. So we'll go in that direction with this then. And for those of you that are in the program itself, of course, you know, we're here to answer any questions that you have along the way. Okay, so first, basically, what's the idea of cyber readiness and what do we do? We bring together senior leaders from global companies to share best practices and resources. And then we develop free content and tools to help you and small companies around the world improve your cyber readiness. So everything that we do is free because we have sponsorship from some major corporations that we'll tell you about in a minute. So these are our member companies, and they've really been with us from the beginning. And not only do they provide us with funding so that we can provide you with free content, but they also provide us with expertise. And they're part of our, what we call our expert group, where we can tap into the resources that they have. Some people say, well, is a company like Microsoft interested in this for trying to promote their services? And absolutely not. They are not interested. They're not using this as a vehicle for generating sales. So you don't need to worry about that. But each of these organizations also have very, very extensive value chains. So for example, with General Motors, we're doing work with their dealer networks to help the dealers in their network become more cyber ready. With Microsoft, we've done webinars for companies that help to, are value-added resellers for Microsoft on how they could help their clients become more cyber ready. So each of these organizations has a real interest in trying to help create a more cyber ready value chain that reaches into small, mid-sized companies. So our approach is really to focus on human behavior. And if you think about cybersecurity, often people will say, well, it's really about people and process and technology. We are really more focused on the people and process side. Of course, we understand that you need technology, but we're here to really help you on the behavioral side is the core. And the topics, based on our research, we really focused on 4 major topics: authentication, which is really passwords. And then if you extend it, you could be thinking about multi-factor authentication. Patching, which is software updates. Phishing, and the use of USBs and removable media. So if you as organizations get better at those 4 things, we know that it will greatly reduce your risk of having a cybersecurity incident. We also have developed guides on ransomware. We have a series of guides I mentioned before on remote work. We have some things that we've done on thinking about what to move to the cloud. So all of these are resources that we provide you. Our goal is to help you create a cyber-ready culture. And to do that, it has to be practical. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how you make that practical along the way, because unfortunately, we see a lot of situations where well-intentioned people put out policies that are really impractical for people to do and do their job. And as a result, they end up creating a workaround culture. And that's something that we want to help you avoid. We want you to have some simple things in place that people follow. The cyber leader is really a key to this. So for each of you on this call, be thinking of yourself as I talk about the cyber leader. That could be a role that you play, or it could be a role that somebody else in your organization plays. Does not need to have strong technical background. And we'll get into that in a little bit. So the whole idea of links in a chain. And here's just a quick article that this was from last summer, where Quest Diagnostics got hacked, not even through the first level, but a second level. So it wasn't through the AMCA. It actually was a vendor to them called Optum. So here's a classic example of a supply chain situation and a value chain situation. So you as organizations also need to be aware of how are other companies that you touch dealing with this issue? Because we're in this collectively. It's not an isolated thing, and you are not an island in this. One of the things I do, and since a lot of you have not registered for the program yet, we really encourage you to do that. Even if you don't go all the way through it, there are different resources along the way that I'll talk about that you could access. 74% of the organizations that go through the program say it has had a high or very high impact on their cyber readiness. And we've now had over 20,000 downloads of content from it. I mentioned before 4 critical issues. And for each of you, these are things to think about, and also some stats here that you can use in talking to other people in your companies about these things. Authentication, and again, the simple way to think about that is really passwords. A lot of the breaches really occur because of weak passwords. If you get your organization to use 2-factor or multi-factor authentication, it's going to cut the potential for breaches radically. Now, I know a lot of people say, well, it's kind of annoying, it's inconvenient. It is. It is a little bit inconvenient, but so is taking your shoes off at airports. But we got used to that. And I think in the long run, people will just need to get used to other forms of authentication. Some of the computers now, or the smartphones now, of course, have facial recognition and other ways to verify. But do be thinking about, in addition to having strong passwords, having some other kind of way to authenticate or verify who it is. And another really cool stat that I love is 17% of people use their favorite sports team in the current year as their password. So if you're a hacker and you're sitting there and trying to go after somebody in Chicago, and you want to do like Chicago Cubs 2020 or Chicago Bears or Pittsburgh Steelers, or go down the list, It's a really, really easy thing. So, and that's just the kind of stat that gets people's attention and that might be helpful in communicating in your company about that. So the next thing is patching, and this is about software updates. And the key thing I want to mention here is that hackers are aware of when software is being updated. So if Microsoft or Adobe issues a software update that has a patch to reduce a vulnerability or patch a vulnerability in the software, the hackers immediately know that that's a vulnerability, and they immediately start to go out to try to find organizations that have not updated their software. So that is really a critical thing where speed is important in patching your software. Phishing is the one that gets the most headlines, and they're getting more and more sophisticated. The increase in phishing attacks over the last 3 months has been astronomical, with more people working remotely. And a lot of them are getting very good at being able to basically compromise your company's email system and send you an email that looks like it's coming from inside your company. So that's something that you need to be aware of. And finally, USBs and the use of removable media. A lot of these have malware on them, and not necessarily from like if you pick one at a conference, it's not necessarily that the conference company is the one that has put it on. A lot of times it comes out of the factory. So somebody could go into a factory producing these things and bribe somebody to place malware on it right from the factory level. So use of USBs is something that we do frown upon, and we hope that you can find alternatives to that. So our program, as I mentioned, goes into 5 stages, and I'm going to go into each stage. I'm going to pause now to see if anybody has any questions so far, and give you a second just to see if you have any questions on what we've covered or some of those 4 major issues. Anything coming in, Marion?
Not yet, but if anything comes up, feel free to put it in the chat, and I'll bring it to the table.
Okay, sounds great. So we are going to go through each of these in more detail. I'm going to just summarize them here. So the first part is getting started, and this is really about selecting the cyber readiness leader. So you may have already been selected as the leader. For those of you that haven't registered yet, that would be part of it, is to think who in your organization would be a good leader. Then we get into assess and prioritize. So the leader, we give them a little bit more background on the 4 issues. We have a worksheet to help you prioritize what to protect, and also to establish some baseline metrics. And the metrics are really simple. It's like, what % of our people are aware of our phishing policy? Do we have a phishing policy? Things like that. They're not really hard metrics to collect, but it is important because the idea of being able to measure something is going to help you to drive improvement. And in the results that we've had with the 74% saying it had very high impact, that little step of just starting to measure things in the beginning makes a big difference. We then get into what we call agree and commit. And this is really where we provide you with policy templates that you then can modify for your organization. And there's a policy related to the 4 issues. In addition, we also provide an incident response plan template. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later. But even though we want you to think about being cyber ready and prevention, you really should assume that at some point you could have an incident. And having a simple plan in place, just knowing what to do, who to call, what to do if somebody in your office or in your company says that their computer's infected or is ransomware attack. Having that in place is really, really helpful, because when you do have an incident, it's really stressful. And you think about it, the analogy I would use is fire, right? We all typically have some idea of what to do if the building we're in catches on fire. And the same should be true of cybersecurity, that you should have some idea of what to do if there's a cyber incident. Then we provide a communication kit for rollout. And this is really to help the cyber leader communicate the new policies and train the workforce. And one thing that we do here is we actually also included for you to use a workforce commitment letter. And it's very simple. It's like half a page or less. But basically, it just says that I, as a employee or contractor in your company, am aware of the cyber policies, and I commit to doing my best to complying with them. So that does a couple things, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but that kind of formality along the way is one of the ways that you start to build up a culture. And then finally, the last step is you redo the metrics, and then we will send you a certificate that your organization has completed the Cyber Readiness Program. And we do have a cyber leader personal certification program in development now that would supplement this. So what I'm
understanding is your corporate vendor triangle. That is crucial.
Hi, could somebody go on mute? Thank you. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through each of the different stages. And if you have any questions, just stop me along the way, send in the chat. So again, getting started is really the first step here. And one of the points of distinction of our program is the idea of the cyber readiness leader. And it's not a technical person, but it is somebody in your organization that should champion the idea of cyber readiness and the idea of prevention, and also be a point person for collecting information from the other people on how's it going. You know, especially in a remote environment now, one of the things that is very important is to reach out to people, not just on the core day-to-day, you know, I need this document from you, or I need you to finish your proposal or submit your report, but also to ask them about how are other things going. Do you understand simple things like this? I was talking to somebody earlier this week, and they had a huge problem in their company with people not knowing where they were actually saving their files to. They were confused about whether it was being saved to their local hard drive, to a file sharing, or exactly what was happening with it. And there were a lot of confusion about that. And then of course that leads to a lot of version control problems. So the cyber leader is really somebody that is there to help to lead the effort. We also do provide background here on how to select and how to be a good cyber leader. What are some of the attitudes and skills that would be required, or not required, but helpful? And as I mentioned before, we're just finishing up a cyber leader certification program where you could get a personal professional credential about being a cyber leader, a CRI certified cyber leader. So that getting started phase is quick. I mean, we've had some companies go through this in like an hour. So we don't want you to think that this is a long, big time commitment, but we've structured it in a way that based on good change management methodology, it's going to help guide you and lead you through this process. So the next thing is to assess and prioritize. And here we give the cyber leader more background on the 4 issues, a little bit more for your education, but also some things that you can share with others. You know, if people push back and say, yeah, you know, why do I need a longer password? You know, why aren't 8 characters sufficient? Well, I was doing a webinar with Marion, and I actually were doing one with the Chief Information Officer for the state of Hawaii. And he had a really cool stat that hackers putting together a number of processors can break an 8 character code in 3 minutes. If you get up to 12 characters, it takes 13 years. So from 3 minutes to 13 years by adding 4 characters. If you go to 13th character, it went to like 3 million years. So every character you add makes it harder and harder for it to be hacked in that way. The other thing, so we actually advocate 16 characters, but then you don't ever really need to change it. And we really encourage people to use passphrases as opposed to passwords because it will be easier for you to remember. So in this stage, the leader's getting background on that. Again, there's online some simple questions to answer that give you some baseline metrics. We have a worksheet helping you to prioritize what to protect. And this is a really important thing too. And when we think about cybersecurity, really there's 2 parts from a business standpoint. There's business continuity, and then there's data protection and preventing loss or corruption of data. When the pandemic hit, everybody was focused specifically, and rightfully so, on business continuity. How do we keep the company running? How do we get people working remotely? What do we do? And a lot of organizations took their eye off the data loss prevention side of things. So what we want to do here in going through this program is we want to help you think about what are the crown jewels of your organization. What would be the most damaging thing either that you couldn't use or it got released publicly? What happens if your website went down? And a simple example here, if you're a law firm and your website goes down, it's not that critical. It's not great, but it's not that critical. If you're a law firm and client information is released or stolen, it's really critical, huge reputational damage. If you're an e-com site or a retailer doing e-com and your website goes down, you're losing money every hour that it's down. So there you would want to focus a little more on prioritizing how do we make sure that our e-com site is continuing to run? How can we still get orders online and things like that? And the other thing that we do is we do provide some guidance, and we have an FAQ also on going to the cloud, trying to help companies think a little bit about what do you do in thinking that through? What things are the easier things to move to the cloud, and what things, how would you prioritize, and then how would you start to manage that process? I'll pause there for a second. Any questions, Marion?
Nope, no questions yet. Just a introduction from Nigeria.
Okay, welcome Nigeria. And I do want to encourage you again to ask questions along the way, because that's, part of what I'm here for is to answer things that are specific to your concerns. Stage 3, here's where we have the policy templates. And we put together some that are really simple and practical, and we try to design them so it minimizes workarounds. So I'll give you a couple examples of workarounds that happen. So one is one small company, small manufacturer, had a policy that said no USBs. And when we started to look and talk to the people in the company, what we saw is that the sales engineers that were going out to meet with clients routinely were bringing back information on USBs. It was just routine. And so I mentioned to them, you guys know that there's a no USB policy. And they said, well, yeah, we do. But if a potential client is going to give us something to bid on, we're not going to say we're not going to take it. And I said, well, has your company given you an alternative to getting the USB? Like, do you have a cloud-based file storage or some other way that you could get the information from the potential client? And they said, well, no, we don't really have that. So here's a situation where the policy, good intention, no USB is good policy, but in reality, they couldn't do that. So you end up with a workaround culture. And then you see, so somebody in accounting sees the sales engineers using USBs, and they're really, really convenient little devices. So then accounting thinks, hey, I got to work over the weekend. I'm going to use a USB to transfer information home. It just creates a workaround culture. So in that case, what we did is they did not want to use a cloud-based file storage because of the client interaction. They wanted to continue accepting the USBs, but we had them set up a non-networked computer. So the sales engineers would bring the USBs back, give it to the designated cyber leader. The cyber leader would make sure it was clean, get the information off, and that was the end of it. Problem solved. But that then helps to reinforce the idea that there are rules, but there was a practical way to deal with it. The other thing I want to mention here is the incident response plan. And if you think about an incident, we really break this down into 3 stages: preparation, response, like what happens during the incident, and then recovery. And the number one thing for all of you to think about in terms of preparation is backups. You need to make sure you have backups, and you need to test them. And that's another thing that people say, wow, that's really inconvenient, having to test backups, or a lot of us don't back up our computers. That's another thing that's important. And here in the incident response plan, we give you kind of step-by-step of good preparation, what to do in an incident. So what should you tell your people to do? And basically our advice is to tell them to disconnect from the network as quickly as soon as they realize there's a problem, disconnect from the network. So turn off their Wi-Fi if they're that, unplug if they're cabled and it's like an Ethernet network, unplug, get off the network is absolutely the first step, because that's going to hopefully prevent it from spreading. But everybody should know that. So those are the kind of things in terms of practical advice that we provide. And if you go through and build up an incident response plan, we also then have posters and templates that you can use to communicate it to the people in your organization. So that's the 3rd step. The other thing in terms of the policies, depending on the size of your organization, it's really important to get feedback from different departments or people before you formalize and try to push out the policies. So depending on the size of your organization, go to other people and say, hey, this is what we're thinking. We got this template from CRI. This is good. We're thinking this could be our new password policy. What do you think about this? Would this work for you? Would this work for your department? Work those things out in advance. 1, so you get buy-in, but 2, so that you get a policy that is practical for your organization. And again, these things don't have to take a lot of time. Some companies go through this phase. It might take a few hours. The policies are all probably less than a page long. It might take a few hours to go through this, but a lot of the cyber leaders are going through the whole program, even if in a company with 50 or 60 people. They're going through this program, spending maybe an hour a week, hour or 2 a week for a couple months, and they're done. There are other things you can do to sustain, but I'm just talking about getting through this program. So it's not a huge time commitment or burden. So after we get these policies agreed to, the next thing that we provide is to roll out. And we have a communication kit here. And this is really an important part too, is how you present it to the people in the organization. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about like behavioral modification and change management and things like that. But if you think about it, people are resistant to change in a lot of instances. And behavioral change is a hard thing for people. We think about it from a personal standpoint, changing whatever your eating behavior, your smoking habits, whatever it would be, behavioral change can be difficult for people. In an organization, it can be more difficult because you have a lot of people you're trying to change. And then the other thing is, a lot of people don't consider cyber readiness. Can somebody go on mute, please? Thanks. A lot of people don't consider cyber readiness to be core to their job. So you're trying to get people to change their behavior a little bit around something that they might find inconvenient in how they perform their job. Not easy stuff, but if you start simple, get some commitment to that from them, tell them why it's important. And that's part of what we do in our communication kits. Not only what to do, but why it's important. And some of the stats that we've seen is that small businesses are highly targeted for cyber attacks. A high percent of small businesses lose customers after a major attack. It can be devastating to a company. So you want the employees to understand the severity of it. It's not something that is kind of vague. You want it to be something more real to them. And it is kind of a balancing act of encouraging the good behavior, but also striking a little bit of fear in people about what can happen. And I think, fire is another good analogy for that. Is, we all have a pretty good understanding that, if our office building or our retail store burns down, that there's devastating consequences to that, setting aside any human injury. But just from a business standpoint, there's devastating consequences. The same thing can happen with cyber. It can be equally devastating in terms of the impact on your business. So you need to find a way to communicate that so that people have commitment. And I always think, I do a lot of work on change management with organizations, actually of all sizes, but I always think in terms of building awareness. So you want to help the workforce be aware of the issue. Gaining their commitment is really the second one. They need to be committed to the idea that that this is important. And then third is that's when you tell them or show them what to do. Awareness, commitment, action is really the right progression for that. If you don't gain commitment from them in the middle, it becomes really hard and you end up circling back often into a workaround culture. This phase is going to take more calendar days, depending on the size of your organization and the number of locations. But in terms of time, it also should not be a huge time commitment. You could have an all-company meeting. Now with Zoom, you could be doing an all-company meeting on Zoom, where you do the initial training. We also do advocate the idea of a workforce pledge. And this, as I mentioned before, gives a little more formality to it. It makes people think about it a little bit, but it also allows you to show that to a third party. So if a customer of yours comes in and says, hey, what are you guys doing around cyber security? You could say, well, we've gone through this program, and in fact, all of our employees and contractors have actually signed a pledge saying that they're aware of our policies and are, agreeing to comply with them. Those little pieces are also helpful in communicating your commitment to your customers or to your suppliers, because again, you're all connected. No company is an island in these days. So that's another piece that's important there, is the idea of getting that little bit of level of commitment. And then the final step is really measuring success. And very simply, you go back to the baseline metrics, you answer the same questions, or it's like 10 questions. And that is one way that you can track the improvement that you've had. We then do ask you a couple very simple survey questions, like what kind of impact it's had. And that's where we get the 74% very high impact. And then we can issue a certificate of completion to you that shows that your organization has gone through this. as I mentioned before, we're now just completing a separate program or course for the cyber leader. So this, what I'm showing you here and showed you here, is really for the organization. How do we help your organization become more cyber ready? And there, I mentioned there are different downloads. You can download policies, the prioritization worksheet, the training materials. We have some really cool posters. And it's great for us. We get pictures of people putting the posters up around the world. Got some great ones from Egypt, of posters there that were put up in the cafeteria. But then the new course is really for the cyber leader. And there we go into a little bit more depth on people. How do you manage people to improve cyber readiness? How do you manage process? And then how do you manage technology? And one of the key things that we're looking at in the technology side a bit is really the relationship between the company, you as a small business, and any kind of managed service provider or IT service provider or cloud service provider. One of the things that we've found is that there's a lot of confusion and maybe a lack of clarity around the role of the small business versus the role of their IT consultant or their managed service provider. And so that's something that we're working on to provide more guidance on that. And that's something that is embedded into the Cyber Leader certification course. In that one, that actually is going to be a personal professional credential that would be issued by CRI to the individual, saying that you actually have completed this. And then we have some other cool things underway now, looking at building networks of cyber leaders, to be able to communicate with each other if that's of interest and things like that. I'm going to pause there and see if we have any questions so far.
Yeah, so we do have a few questions actually. We have someone asking if we help to provide a basic network architecture that's required to take adequate cyber attack protection.
We don't actually specify certain architecture. Again, we're more focused on the people and process side of it. Part of the work that we're going to be doing with looking at managed service providers would be helping you to understand what kind of questions to ask a managed service provider so that you would get something that was scoped appropriately for your organization. But that's not really something that we're not involved in, that kind of technical specifications.
And then another question asking if we recommend any incentives or penalties for behavior.
That's a great question. And if you look at it across the board, I personally think that a combination of the carrot and the stick is the best approach. And depending on the culture of your company, I tend to think that you should have clearly defined penalties so that there should be clarity around that. If people are not following certain rules, what is the repercussion? What is the escalation from a disciplinary standpoint? But once those are established, and that can be part of the training that you do, then I encourage that you do have incentives. And the incentives can be either recognition. It could be something, you know, like modest monetary value. I mean, a lot of companies do things like, you know, dinner certificate or, you know, free lunch at the cafeteria or something like that. It can be a minor monetary reward, but I think recognition rewards also are very effective. And we see those in use a lot. So I think it's a great question. And again, I would have a balanced approach that does clearly define the disciplinary, the penalties, but then you focus on driving positive behavior through the rewards.
Great. And then next question, which I think might need a little bit more elaboration, but someone's wanting to know if company information based in the cloud can still be attacked. Oh, I see it. More came later, but could company information based in the cloud still be attacked without the 4 key cyber readiness principles, our 4 key pillars? Is the cloud still vulnerable?
If it's based in the cloud, and you're saying that if the cloud service provider themselves were attacked directly, then yes, it could be, but that would be, you know, the companies, the major cloud service providers have extensive security provisions in place. So if you're thinking about Azure or AWS or Google or iCloud, I mean, they have enormous security measures in place and monitoring, and so I would not be as concerned about that. But yes, theoretically it could be. But I think I would encourage you to focus on the more likely route would be that somebody in your company was spoofed into going to a fake website and giving some kind of some of their passwords, or doing something like that that then would enable the hackers to get into your cloud, your virtual server. That would be more of a concern. And then the 4 issues on that would definitely be helpful. And if any of you, if I don't answer your questions sufficiently, come back and we can talk about it more. You know, just ask for follow-up.
And the last question that's in the chat right now is asking, how can SMEs protect their e-commerce websites from cyber attacks?
I guess in part, this again would depend on where it's hosted. And in terms of the e-com site as a whole, you know, there are different pieces to it that you're trying to protect. So one would be the payment processing piece. And a lot of times now for some of the companies, you know, they're often using an external vendor to do the payment processing. So that would be one piece to it. The other would be actually the order taking piece of it. So part of it would depend on how you had been developing it and what software is being developed with. So that's something that we'd have to dig into a little bit more detail to be able to help you. But again, I would segregate, as you do your analysis of it, I would segregate the different aspects of the e-com. You know, the public part where people are just coming and browsing your product list or service list. The other part where they actually go into an order taking mode. And then the other part where they go into the payment mode would all be separate things that you would want to be thinking about. And then the other thing would be also is, what information do you store and keep? So there's different trends now among companies as to how much do they want to keep. Do they want to retain credit card information? If so, do they retain it on their own server, or is it retained on the server of of outside vendor that providing secure storage of personal identifiable information? So hopefully that was helpful. There are a lot of variables in the question you asked.
And with that, those are all the questions we have in the chat right now. So I don't know if anyone has anything else they want to ask.
Does anybody want to come off mute and ask questions verbally? What about anybody who has been going through the program? I noticed that there were some of you who have started the program. Any of you would like to provide comments on your experience so far? That would be really helpful for us and probably for the others. So if anybody who's started the program wants to speak up about where you are and what your experience has been, we'd really appreciate that. I don't think we're getting a lot of takers on that one.
Yeah. Hey, hi. Hello.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. So after this basic program, so this is what I feel is, this is something a cyber readiness program, which, an entry level person who is not acquainted much more with cyber security knowledge would be of a great help. But going forward, do you have something on a technical basis also, which, down the line would get acquainted for people who are taking this program to have much more technical knowledge on it?
Yeah, so the next piece that we have is the Cyber Leader certification, and that does have a component on technology. But even that one is going to be, it'll be a step more sophisticated. It will familiarize yourself with probably, with the most common attack methods. It would familiarize you with some of the basic technology for protection. And it really focuses also on the core of it, and that next level would be to help you to be able to talk to cybersecurity technology vendors, ask for the right questions, understand their responses and how it fits into your company, and then be able to communicate that back to others in your company. Beyond that, we have not yet thought about our next step. If we would go continue in a technical direction. We also work with other groups like the Global Cyber Alliance. And we could also pull in more technical information from some of the other groups that are part of our network. But the Cyber Leader certification definitely takes it in another level of technical detail.
Thanks
Is
for
that
that.
an area that you think would be useful?
Yeah.
Anybody else want to comment? If you don't have any other comments or questions, we can wrap this up. We've got a few minutes left. We're 8 minutes early.
Yeah, it's a good initiative to be, it's for people like us where we are new to cyber. It's a very good initiative with this institute, and looking forward for such information and such webinars which can enhance our knowledge.
That's great. And that's really what it's geared for. And then the other thing is, on our website, in addition to the program, we do have a series of remote guides. So we have guides on things like remote work from a manager standpoint. We have employee do's and don'ts, things that employees should and should not do when working remotely. We have something on building a culture of remote cyber readiness. So those are other resources that are available to all of you, and we would encourage you to look at those and use those also. Okay, well, I guess with that, Marion, I guess we can wrap it up.
Yeah, and we recorded this session, so I'll be sending out the slide deck and the recording in case you want to come back to any of this content or come up with any questions. Feel free to reach out to Craig or myself, and we'll be happy to answer those questions for you. Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Lewis.
Take care.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Greg.
You're welcome. Stay in touch with us. We're here to help you.